Hello everyone and welcome to the WeedSmart webinar. We're coming to you live from Wagga Wagga from Charles Sturt University and DPI in New South Wales, and it's great to have a live audience here in Wagga and also an online audience, so great to have everybody on board. Well, a well-known researcher from this part of the world by the name of Dr. Dick Med, based in Orange, started talking about the weed seed bank in the 1980s, a long time ago, and the importance of using the weed seed bank to manage herbicide-resistant weeds, and we're still talking about it. But it seems that part of the industry is on board and part of the industry is not on board yet. So today what we'd like to do is talk about the importance of managing weeds through managing the weed seed bank rather than short-term approaches, and also talk about what makes growers make that switch from managing the weed seed bank to compared to using the short-term fixes. My name's Peter Newman. I'm the leader of communications from the Australian Herbicide Resistance Initiative. They're based at the University of Western Australia. And I've been involved in grain cropping for 20 years, and 15 of which I've been focused almost entirely on managing herbicide-resistant weeds. And so I'm working with a small communications team there to communicate AHRI's messages widely. Now, today's webinar is hosted by GRDC and also by WeedSmart. Now, you may have heard a little bit about WeedSmart. WeedSmart's a campaign that's been going for about 18 months now, and it's funded by a combination of industry funds, so from a lot of the chemical and seed companies around the country, and also co-contribution from GRDC. And so that money comes together. AHRI is leading WeedSmart at the moment. WeedSmart started out as an awareness initiative to raise awareness about managing herbicide-resistant weeds, and in the next 12 months you'll see some changes that bring it more to a solutions initiative, so a solutions campaign to look at all the options for managing herbicide-resistant weeds. So you hear a little bit more about WeedSmart through the day. WeedSmart has a hashtag on Twitter, #WeedSmart, and also a website which is currently being updated with more information. So I've got a live panel here of experts from around the country. I'd like to just introduce them now, and these people are going to be sharing their experiences and answering a lot of the questions from the live audience and from our webinar audience. First up I have Professor Deirdre Lamel. I got it out this time, Deirdre. Deirdre's a weed scientist and director of the Graham Centre here at Wagga Wagga, and she's been in that role for 30 years now, so wealth of experience with Deirdre. Next to Deirdre is Mr. Ken Young. Ken is from GRDC. He's the manager of the Plant Health Technologies. A lot of his portfolio is on weeds and pesticides. Thanks for joining us, Ken. Next up, I have Lachlan Caldwell. Lachlan is an agronomist with Delta Agribusiness based at Grenfell. He's been in that role for 9 years now. Lachlan's got a long experience with spending most of his time reacting to weed problems with his clients, but also a lot of experience with conservation agriculture and comparing seeding systems. Next to Lachlan is Michael Witterick. Michael's our man from the north in this webinar. Michael is the principal weed scientist with AgriScience Queensland, part of the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. He's based in Toowoomba. He's been there for the past 15 years, and we'll be talking to Michael a lot today about how a lot of these questions relate to northern cropping systems. Most of the rest of us are really representing southern cropping systems. Murray Scholes, next in line. Murray is a grain grower from Kulkan in New South Wales. He was a Nuffield Scholar in 2008. There have been no tilling since the early 70s on their farm, and they've been in continuous crop since 1982. Murray tells me that he has never cultivated a field, so that tells you a little bit about how he farms. And last and definitely not least, Ray Harrington on the end. Ray's travelled from Western Australia with me. Ray is a grain grower from Darkin, father of many inventions in agriculture, and also inventor of the Harrington seed destructor. So thanks for joining us, Ray. So for those of you viewing online, now's the time to start putting your questions in. We're talking about managing herbicide-resistant weeds through managing the weed seed bank. So please use the webinar to put some questions up, and we'll get to those as it goes. So first up, I'd like to throw the first question and start by asking the growers. We talk about the weed seed bank. The people like me, scientists and people in the ag industry, we've talked about the weed seed bank a lot, and it seems to me that there is a point in time at which a grower switches in mindset from taking a short-term approach and using just herbicides mainly, to taking a more long-term approach and managing his weed problem through the weed seed bank. So I'll ask you, Murray, first, what was the thing that made you change your approach to farming where you started managing weeds through the seed bank?
Well, Peter, to put it in one word, disaster. We had a complete crop failure. It had been a paddock that had been in crop for nearly 20 years. Ryegrass had been at levels that were building, but we were sort of putting up with them. And we planted lupins back in 2000 in this paddock, and the ryegrass just choked them completely out. Complete disaster. So that really forced a rethink. You know, they say experience is something you get when you get a result you didn't want. Well, we certainly got a lot of experience that year.
Yeah, and so what did you do?
We brown manured the paddock, and then we planted oats on it the following year to make silage. We were incredibly particular. We didn't graze it for 2 years. We don't run sheep, we only have cattle, so it only got slightly grazed if it is being grazed, but so there was no stock on it. We gramoxoned any regrowth after the silage, and we were able to, by taking out, preventing anything setting seed for 2 years, we were able to eliminate ryegrass from that paddock, and we're 13 years later and we still haven't got ryegrass in that paddock. So if you can wear the pain, you can beat the problem.
So short-term pain for long-term gain.
Yes.
Yeah. So Ray, what was it for you? What was it that the switch in your mind that made you think, all right, I've got to manage weeds through managing the seed bank?
Peter, slightly different circumstances. Being an avid wool grower and, like you said, inventor of a lot of sheep handling equipment. Come 96, when my brother and I went our own way farming and Dad retired, I had 12,500 sheep. I just sold my first wool clip and I got $2.05 a kilo in the bank. And I straight away thought I've got a lot of farming in front of me. I made the decision then that I'd go total cropping in the best sheep country in Australia. And I still believe the West Arthur Shire is the best sheep country in Australia. And I straight away knew in my mind, when you look at the experience in WA of the Hydes and the Shields who had the worst ryegrass resistance in the world, back 32 years ago, they brought the chaff carts in from Canada, the ready crop chaff carts. Now, I figured that I was no cleverer than all my co-farmers in WA, and I would have to go down the path of weed seed management when my 12,500 sheep went out the gate. So, and they went out the gate on one day. And in my mind, I developed in my mind, I built things in my mind first, the project was the big C for chaff. I was going to catch it, cart it, cook it, crush it or cremate it. And that was where I started, and that was my decision. So it wasn't about disasters like Murray, but I foresaw the disaster.
Yep.
So I followed all the valuable information out of WA.
Yeah, you looked at what other people were doing. And I guess that's what today is a bit about, sharing some of those experiences, and perhaps some of the listeners out there will pick up that message. Lachlan, I'll throw to you now. On this issue, you're working as an agronomist in New South Wales. How many of your clients, or how do you see your clients reacting to herbicide-resistant weeds? How many of them are focused on the long-term seed bank approach, and how many are still really focused on managing weeds with mainly just using herbicides and selective herbicides?
Yeah, Peter, the majority of our clients would still be focusing on that short-term 1 year, how do I kill it or get rid of it this year. Maybe 25% of our growers would be starting to focus on the seed bank, with a long-term approach in mind with some strategic tools and tactics, to implement and prevent that plant from setting seed each year and continually topping up the seed bank. It's something that makes our job a lot easier, to have a client that's proactive and looking forward to try and expect the unexpected and prevent that disaster from unfolding.
Yep. Thanks. So do we have any questions from the floor? And it's time for those people at home to ask questions via webinar. Do we have any questions relating to this issue of that switch between taking a short-term approach and a long-term approach?
Hi, I'm just wondering how difficult it is to get people to make that switch initially, and ways we can increase the rates of take-up in that regard. So
maybe straight back to Lachlan.
Yeah, that's my hurdle, I guess, with my clients, and it's quite easy when they have a disaster because you're at the end of the road and you've got to go left or right. So the decision then's quite easy. The guys that haven't reached that point in time, increasing their level of awareness is a challenge, and I think that's just about education and advice. I think, like myself as an advisor, it's my job to actually educate and steer the grower in the right direction. So I think there's a lot of opportunities going forward there in the advisory side of the field to try and not prolong but prevent some of these disasters from happening and dig into our seed bank and make some real headway.
Yeah, so is it fair to say that that there are a lot of growers where they're still getting a lot of good efficacy out of their herbicides, and for that reason it is sort of prolonging that decision to take long-term approaches?
Definitely, yeah. We're still getting pretty good use out of most of our herbicides. Resistance certainly is here, but I think that crossroad is being prolonged because we're still getting a little bit of efficacy out of our herbicides. So I think now's our opportunity to take some proactive action and move forward.
Yeah. And Ken, did you have a comment there?
Well, yeah, on the awareness side, I think that's GRDC and industries recognise that, and that's why WeedSmart, the first thing was the awareness program to get it out there and raise the profile that we've got to look at a total management of weeds, not just that 1 year, and that's how WeedSmart got born.
So Deirdre, you've been working in this area for a long time. What have you seen with growers that when they make that switch?
Well, one of the things that the early research did when we had the weed CRC was modelling to show how different control tactics impact on the weed seed bank. And I think what we need to do is get some of that modelling out there. There are programs and models like RIM that have been used. Maybe we need to do some more work to get those models out there and used more widely by the growers and the advisors.
Yeah, well, one of the guys that we travel with a bit, Lance Turner, he's one of the champions of the chaff cart in Western Australia, and he went to a RIM workshop 15 years ago and came out of that. He said he couldn't make his system work without adding a chaff cart, and he went home and he bought one, and then he redeveloped it to make that chaff cart work. So
it did work.
It did work. The computer models did work. Okay, I think we might... Okay, let's throw to this first question. It's come in via webinar, and I'll just read the question out and then I'll try and work out who to send it to. How important is it to use integrated weed management strategies? Is there too much dependence on herbicides? Michael, you haven't had a swing yet, so I might handball that one to you first.
Okay, so basically integrated weed management strategies are the only way to provide sustainable long-term management of your weed problems. I'll give you perfect example of what's happening in the north. We have both summer and winter cropping options. Whether you're trying to manage your winter weeds in a winter fallow or your summer weeds in a summer fallow, the go-to herbicide there is glyphosate. As a result of our heavy reliance on glyphosate, we now have several summer grass weed species that are resistant to glyphosate. We're currently looking into a population of common sow thistle that may also have glyphosate resistance. We have fleabane resistance, ryegrass resistance, barnyard, liverseed grass resistance, all to glyphosate. So this is all eventuated because of an over-reliance on one individual strategy. Now, I've drawn there on, I guess, the main problem in the north at the moment, which is your glyphosate resistance. But if there's an over-reliance on any one strategy, you're going to have a shift towards certain weed species. So here I've given an example of reliance on a herbicide. Even if you were relying on a non-crop option, for example, let's say we went back to using conventional cultivation, we know that that favours certain weeds as well, like your nut grasses and different things like that. So certainly integrated weed management is vitally important. One, to stop herbicide resistance, but two, also to reduce the density of weeds that you're actually trying to control.
Yeah, well, I'll make a comment there. I travelled around a bit of the country in Western Australia with Ray and some other growers, Michael Walsh from AHRI and others, and we did some workshops. And before we did our first workshop, we didn't really speak to each other, we just sort of knew our topics. And we sort of realised at the end of the workshop, we hadn't actually talked about herbicide resistance at all. We just talked about weed management, and we talked about managing weeds through harvest weed seed control. So integrated weed management, I think, is really just about managing weeds. It doesn't matter whether they're resistant or not. Ray, you went to the Global Herbicide Resistance Challenge conference in Fremantle in February, and you saw some reactions from the Americans sitting there who had broken glyphosate in a big way and weren't particularly using integrated weed management. I just wonder if you wanted to comment about what you saw there.
Peter, I was blown away. The first 2 days of the conference, about 400 international delegates, and quite frankly, the first morning we had the American people at the podium giving us presentations on glyphosate resistance, and they just about had tears rolling down their cheeks.
Tears of blood, I think.
Tears of blood, I did say, Peter. We crop 7 million hectares in WA. Just to give you one slight clue, they are now hand weeding 7 million hectares. The same area in WA, there's a weed called Palmer amarantha. It comes up with the crop. They had photos there. It is a metre above the cab of the John Deere header. And they are hand weeding 7 million hectares because their crops have been glyphosate tolerant, corn, soybean, maize, like that. And they've just broken the golden rule, and they got serious issues. These things, they've got a stalk about 2 inches across and the header goes in, boom, busts the knife up. They got serious issues because they just went down one path.
So they didn't use an integrated approach, they just used exclusively glyphosate for about a decade, and that was the result. Okay, I've got a question from the live audience here.
Rob Cumming from southern New South Wales. Does this not point to a conflict between the advertising by herbicide companies and what we really need to do in the field? Deirdre.
Deirdre, all right, you've been
Thank you.
pointed at.
Well, obviously the herbicide companies are trying to make money. I think we need to remember that herbicides are a very useful tool. They're very effective and efficient and easy to use. However, they need to be used carefully so that they last a long time and are useful for a long time. The point of integrated weed management is making sure that we have a range of control tactics in place, as well as herbicides, so that we prolong the life of those very useful and important herbicides.
I'll just add another comment there. WeedSmart, this is funded by those chemical companies and GRDC, and they're really doing it because they want to put out a responsible message and they want to be seen to be coming up with an integrated weed management plan. So when I speak to the big companies, I really get the feeling that they want their products to last for a long time. The longer their product lasts, the more money they can make out of it. So integrated weed management to prolong the life of a product, I think, is in the company's interest. I know you seem a bit cynical there, but but that's your point of view. But yeah, I actually think that from what I've seen in the companies in recent times, I think most of them have been quite responsible. But you're shaking your head.
Peter, I mean, to develop a new mode of action or a new chemical to come onto the market, you're looking, somewhere between 150 and 250 million dollars to get it onto the market. They've got about 15 years from when they first take their patent out, and that's well done before the discovery. So by the time it's registered, they've got somewhere between maybe 5 up to about 10 years to actually recoup that dollars in it. So if that chemical is overused and resistance is quickly developed, they're not going to get even their patent life out of it. So they've got big interest to ensure that their chemical is used well in a good stewardship manner to prolong its life.
Okay, we'll go to a question from a webinar viewer here. It's a comment from David. David says, we never thought much of weed seed control until we started it many years ago. How important does grazing play in summer weed management? We think so. Michael, are you prepared to have a swing at this one? You're probably in an area where...
Sure. I think it's probably come from the north as a question. There's just been a survey that's been completed about 2 weeks ago. One of the questions in that survey was in relation to grazing and how commonly people are using it to target their summer grass weeds. and about 50% of the respondents to that survey said that they are now using grazing to manage their summer grass weeds. Now, we haven't done any recent research in terms of how effective grazing is, whether or not the grazing process actually destroys the weed seeds if you're grazing at that stage. So I'm not actually able to give any information on how effective it is, but if 50% of the respondents to this survey are using it, it's obviously been seen as a viable option in addition to other things we have available to manage our summer grass weeds.
Yeah, I'll add a comment to the grazing summer weeds as well. In my part of the world, northern wheat belt of Western Australia, a lot of the livestock left after droughts in 06 and 07. And we've got a lot of continuous crop, very few livestock, and summer weed control has become an enormous challenge. And particularly we're seeing a lot of grasses, so a lot of sort of subtropical type grasses coming into the system, which has meant that now all of our summer weed control involves glyphosate. Years ago it used to just be phenoxys and garlon and so on for melons, but now there's grasses in the system, we're using glyphosate all summer as well. When we had livestock grazing summer weeds, we didn't have that reliance on glyphosate. So that's just it puts more pressure on glyphosate. Okay, another question in from the webinar. What are some examples of biological control of ryegrass instead of using chemicals and crop rotations? So Deirdre, you want to have a swing at that one?
Yeah, I'll have a go. Biological control is using either insects or diseases to control weeds, and you go back to the country of origin of the weed and look for insects or diseases that attack the plant in its native range. In Australia, in annual cropping systems, it's very difficult for biological control to work. Most of the biological control in Australia is on perennial species, where you've got a continuous growth of the plant for the biocontrol agents to live on. In annual systems where we have the hot, dry summer, particularly in the south, often there's not a continuous growth of the weed, and so it's much harder to get biological control to work. There has been some preliminary research scoping studies done looking at biocontrol for annual weeds, particularly wild radish and fumitory, but at this stage that hasn't led to any likelihood of a practical biological control solution.
So in summary, there's been quite a bit of biological control work done, but we don't really have any practical solutions at the moment.
Not at this stage.
Yep.
If we go back to Steve Powell's, when he was actually running the weed CRC, taking biological control to a broader context, sheep was his major item at that stage.
Okay.
And if we take it even further, work that DG's done on crop competition to bring in the other aspects of other management tools as well.
Yep. Well, we've got
going further than ryegrass, Deidre's group at CSU are looking at doing a scoping study for fleabane for biological control. So it's not an option we're giving away on yet for other weeds. So we're still looking for those alternative management techniques as well.
Thanks, Ken. All right, now a question's come in on the webinar, and it's good timing because I wanted to switch the discussion now to some harvest weed seed control techniques. And before we go to the question, I'd like to refer to the PowerPoint slide. We've only got a couple of PowerPoint slides today. This is a bit of work that I personally did when I was with the Department of Agriculture and Food in WA, funded by GRDC, and we monitored 30 focus paddocks. And what we did was we just counted weeds in those focus paddocks every spring in sort of August, September, and monitored how the growers were going about it. And what the graph shows is that we've got 16 growers, in fact, in these on the black line, where they're really mainly herbicide dominant. They are using quite a few other tools as well, but they're using mainly herbicides to control ryegrass. Whereas the red line there is growers that are also using some harvest weed seed control, and most of that is narrow windrow burning. Now you can see that both groups have been very successful at eroding their weed seed bank very well, but the black line has done it mainly through herbicides and mainly through pouring on a lot of pre-emergent herbicides, whereas the red line there, including some windrow burning and harvest weed seed controls, a couple of people with chaff carts, after 4 years they had the numbers right down, and then since 2008 have been almost on zero. And I've just been out and counted those paddocks again, so we're keeping that going, and there's no surprises. Wherever people are using harvest weed seed control regularly, their paddocks are very, very clean. And this is probably a unique bit of data that shows how well it does work. So if we can throw to some questions on that. We've got a question came in on the webinar. It says, Ken and Peter, given the resistance to chemicals, what research is currently funded for mechanical and or physical destruction and is automation part of this strategy? So Ken, did you want to comment about GRDC's investment and then we might throw to Ray?
Okay, yeah. Well, we've got a range of mechanicals and I'll leave Ray to talk about his seed destructor, but we've got a couple of projects underway at the present moment. One is specifically on microwaves, just funding some original biological work, but also the fundamentals required before it can come to commercialisation. Some basic questions that need to be answered first, that'll be done. There's also another project on the automation side, and we've actually got some limited expression of interest out at the present moment. Now, they're probably the automation side of things. We're looking at it from a split level. One is the delivery machine, so how you detect the weed. Then it might be the automation of a machine that goes out and actually kills the weed. But what to kill the weed, there's obviously, you can use chemicals, you can use some form of physical damage, whether it's heat or cultivation, but trying to do it in a site-specific management way. So they're the sort of works, areas that GRDC is starting to invest in, or sorry, not starting to, have invested in.
So Ray, the HSD or the Harrington seed destructor is obviously a physical destruction of weed seeds. I know this could blow out for a while here, but do you want to give us a little bit of a summary on where things are at with the destructor and maybe a bit of a comment about GRDC's investment in that?
Well, I guess I'll start at the beginning. This project's 17 years old since I first come up with the idea and battled on and built my own with the help of the Glen boys, built our own. And then got involved with University WA, with what was AHRI then, Stephen Powell and Michael Walsh, who actually tested what we built to actually see if it worked. It was wonderful to have this mill that I found out of the coal mining industry, and nothing new in agriculture. This mill is 100 years old, built by a man named Stedman in the US for the mining industry, so nothing new in agriculture. So basically then we got it working. Then got involved with, were really involved with Uni WA, got what I call the tick of approval, which meant go for it. And Stephen Powell's budget actually funded the building of the first one onto a trailer on the header, and a mate of mine, Ron Knapp, helped me put it on the header. And Stephen Powell's given me $20,000. It was like baiting a shark hook. It certainly cost a lot more than that. But when we got that, got it in the paddock, Michael Walsh started doing the testing in the paddock, the actual physical testing in the crop, it really did ramp up. And that's when GRDC got involved. I'm only a small farmer, I'm only a couple of thousand hectares, and I figured it was going to cost $1 million for me to commercialise it. And you have to appreciate, we've commercialised 6 or 7 other products, so it's not new territory. And I figured my farm couldn't take the risk. Through Stephen Powell's, we made an application to GRDC. And interesting enough, I had to do the application myself because Stephen Powell's was busy. We were funded in 5 weeks. So I now call the thing the project. So to every grower that's delivered a tonne of grain in Australia, you are part of this project. You have funded it. It is running around about $1.8–2 million currently, and that's the engineering side, the evaluation side, the whole thing. So really, all you cockies out there, this is your project, and if it wasn't for GRDC, we wouldn't have it where it is today. On our farm, we're currently running 2 trail behinds that we worked out the other night have done around about 12,000 hectares. And they'll be going back in again this year, those 2. And you might have heard a little rumour around the traps that there's some innovation going into incorporated in the header. Well, the rumour's right, because there's a new header parked outside the shed yesterday, and we'll be looking at having the mill in the header this year. But don't forget, we are talking 2 different opportunities. The trail behind will be there for a long time with the smaller headers, but you've got to go find yourself 500 or 600 horsepower to have it incorporated in the header. So bear with us, watch this space. It's evolution. We're still only at the FJ Holden. We've got a long way to go to the Commodore, but it's all heading in the right direction. And for me, this next couple of weeks will be either very exciting or very, maybe disappointing even, but I've got a lot of hope for what's happening.
Yep. So Ray, just this year there's going to be the integrated ones on the back of a header that you've purchased and one in South Australia, is that right?
The
more evaluation?
UniSA Engineering Division, Chris Saunders and Nick Berry, they have taken all the data of what we've captured over the last 5 or 6 years, and with modern technology and a couple of good brains like those, they've taken this and they've changed the design of everything, and it's evolution. And we were privileged to watch this thing work in the paddocks in South Australia in the middle of January last year. It blew us away how well it worked. I've probably put my money where my mouth is. I've bought a Class 9 header that I don't really need.
Just like most other farmers, Ray.
I've got 2 headers. I've got 3 headers. I don't need this one, but we're doing that to have a go, try and accelerate the progress of it. But quite excited about it. But the trail behind will still suit the smaller headers.
So there's going to be 3 or 4 trail behinds. They're built by De Bruin Engineering. I think all of them in Western Australia at the moment, to my knowledge. But yeah, there's only a handful of those being built, but they are still commercially available. Yeah. So we'll keep the discussion going on harvest weed seed control, I think. So those people listening on the webinar, please keep your questions coming in. But let's focus on harvest weed seed control for a few minutes. Do we have questions from the floor on that issue?
Yeah, Peter, a question to you, mate, is the benefits with growers I've seen with no-till have been pretty amazing, and Western Australia with things that Ray's done over there particularly, but stubble retention, early sowing, so we've had a heavy dependence on herbicides to do that, but we've also lifted the bar of yield potential.
Yep.
So when you sort of suggest to growers, like, look at cultivating or even burning, it's really hard for them to go back, but the harvest weed seed management side of things is a completely different kettle of fish. So do you want to expand on that, how you haven't, I guess, taken away the gains of no-till, but still pursued this weed seed management path?
That's a really good question. From what I've seen in Western Australia, the measurement for me with how are people going with managing weeds is, can they keep cropping a large area and sow it early? And that's how you make money out of integrated weed management. And when we travel around with Lance Turner, Lance starts sowing on the calendar. And the key is that he's driven his weed seed bank so low that he can seed when he wants to. He doesn't have to wait for germination. So I think point number 1 is that investing in harvest weed seed control, other tools to drive a seed bank down, increases yield, not so partially through having less weeds in your crop, but more so through the advances you're talking about the real early sowing and stubble retention. And so that's probably part 1. In terms of stubble retention, one of the big parts of harvest weed seed control is you've got to harvest at beer can height. That's the internationally accepted height. We talk about the beer can. So you've got to be harvesting low, which means growers are setting their paddock up for good stubble management the following year. And the advances I've seen, we've got big headers that can gobble up a huge amount of trash, of volume. They can harvest low and they can spread the straw, and the machinery that we're seeing, we can actually do things like narrow row spacing because the new machinery can handle more stubble. So we are still no-tilling. We're improving our yield through row spacing and time of sowing and so on. So the benefits from harvest weed seed control and from integrated weed management are not just about having less weeds in your crop. It's about the whole farming system. Does that answer part of the question? Does anyone else on the panel want to make a comment there?
I'd like to make a comment. Look, I believe in agriculture. Anything that seems to work for us, and I'm putting my 51st crop in, everything that seems to really work for us is a pain in the arse. Let's be honest.
We are recording this, Ray.
Yeah, but that's the fact of life. We don't want to be dragging a HSD. We don't want to be dragging a chaff cart. We don't want to be row burning. We don't want to be doing all this. We would rather be sitting in there with full bore getting the crop off. But look, if we don't do something at harvest, in what I've seen in WA, what I've seen at home, it's all right. It's all right for the older blokes in the audience, and like me, all right for the older blokes. But for the young fellas, Pete, I reckon if this bloke doesn't do something with harvest weed seed management in the next 5 to 7 years, you're out of the game.
Out of the game, Ray.
Yeah, you're out of the game because
Good thing he's an agronomist, that one, but
the weed seeds are calling the shots.
yeah.
And I think that's what we've got to understand. The weeds are actually calling the shots, and we're engaged in a war with the weeds. And from my army days, and blow me down, I was in Wagga Wagga there, National Service. I was in Kapuka. When we were in the army, we were taught to win the battles, and then you win the war. But see, we're in a war with weeds, so we need to win the battles, which is all the things: harvest weed seeds, management, row spacing, competition. They're all the battles, and that's the way I see it. And look, it's got to change the mindset. Cutting low in 6-tonne crops is not easy, and this is where the researchers have got to come in and start growing the dwarf crops. A little bit more dwarf, and I hear there's a wheat this morning that's 16 inches lower, and then you can get down and skid the ground and get 20 or 30% more weeds, and that's the way I see the whole big picture.
Yep. So Murray, you want to make a comment here, but I'd also, as you're making a comment, like to ask you about how confident you are about the future of cropping. I mean, you hit a big problem in 2000 and you're managing resistant weeds. Are you optimistic about the future of continuous grain cropping?
Yeah, I am actually. I think weed management's probably not actually the biggest problem with continuous cropping. I think nutrition management and that sort of thing is a bigger issue. The thing with weed management is, and I agree with Ray, integrated weed management is a pain in the backside. It's hard work. You've got to be thinking maybe 2 or 3 years ahead. It isn't as simple as driving to town and going, what drum of stuff do I need to put in the back of the ute to go home with? And the more work you want to put into it, the more success you're going to have. And again, probably a bit like we said earlier, the more willing you're going to accept the early pain, the better the results are. I can't afford to take my entire farm out of production for 2 years to wipe out that seed. So I've got to live with a low level of ryegrass through the farm, and I also know that if I do something wrong, I'm going to have a blowout. So you've got to be constantly in that mindset that if something goes wrong, I've got to jump on it. I need to go in and make silage of the bad patches that are blown out, because often there might be only 5 acres in a 100 hectare paddock, But once the headers pick that ryegrass seed up and spread it over the paddock, the next year you've got 50 acres, and then the following year you've got the whole paddock, and then you've got a complete and utter disaster.
So it's about not accepting any seed set.
No, minimising seed set.
Yep.
And things like row burning have been very successful for us. It's a great way of, the way we're going with early seeding and that, we're really selecting our ryegrass for late germinating ryegrass. Pre-emergence, knockdowns, they're all going to take the ones that come up in April, May, or if you're sowing as late as May. But we're now selecting for ryegrass, it's only like 60-day growing season or even less. I reckon we're going to start seeing ryegrass that's probably got a 30-day growing season, because that's what we're taking out all the other ones and leaving. And harvest weed management is a great way of turning those round. Either that or brown manure, same thing.
So spoken like a grower who is on top of his weed problem, there are bigger problems than weeds in continuous cropping. We found in Western Australia that a lot of growers found weeds to be their number one issue years ago, because they were really battling with herbicide resistance, and you speak to them a few years later and they say exactly the same thing. Yep, I'm comfortable with managing weeds, I've got bigger challenges in continuous cropping now. Michael, in the northern part of the cropping system over here, is harvest weed seed control something that is being used or talked about, or is it not as prevalent?
Yeah, good question. Harvest weed seed control is such a new concept for the north. So it's something that's being talked about. It's really, I think, has only been talked about for maybe the last 2 or 3 years to any great detail. We did a survey in wheat, chickpea and sorghum crops in the 2011-12 season to see what weed species were actually present in crop and setting seed, just to get an idea of whether or not there's a need for harvest weed seed control in the north. So we did a random survey right across the northern region, so going from northern New South Wales right up to central Queensland. Overall, we found 70 different weed species in crop. So for a start, you can see that the northern region is quite unique. We've both got winter and summer cropping options, but we have a huge suite of weed species present. Out of these weed species that we found, most of them were setting seed in crop at harvest time. So again, it's clearly pointing towards the fact that our in-crop weed management is not doing the job sufficiently in terms of stopping that weed seed being produced and returned to the seed bank. So from that perspective, I see that there definitely something needs to be done to stop that weed seed setting crop. Whether or not harvest weed seed control fits in our system is another question. The two main weeds that we found in crop producing seed above harvest height were fleabane and common sow thistle. Now, both of these species have wind dispersed weed seeds, and both of these species don't set their seed all at the one time. So if you're going through and harvesting, and let's say you've got your Harrington seed destructor attached to your header, firstly, we don't know how much of that weed seed is actually going through the header that can then be destroyed. And that they're such small weed seeds too, especially fleabane, whether or not the Harrington seed destructor would be able to destroy the weed seeds. Some of the other species that we found were quite common, wild oats, with quite a large amount of seed being retained at harvest time, which we thought was quite a surprise. We thought a lot of the seed may have already been dropped from wild oats. There's another potential target. And what I see as the main potential targets are our brassica weed species in our broadleaf crops. So in chickpea, we found a huge population of turnip weed and African turnip weed, and most of them retaining nearly all of their seed at harvest time. So similar to your wild radish,
Yep.
Potentially a role there.
So you did a survey and you found 70 weeds. If you did that in Western Australia, you'd be lucky to find 4,
Yeah.
I think. But and ryegrass and radish would be the two main ones, but it really does show the difference in the challenge for the northern cropping zone. You've got so many weeds and a lot of different ecology with their seed bank life and so on. That's right. Yeah, probably future evaluation to see if harvest weed seed management fits there. Lachlan, a comment from you, from your part of the world. Any growers taking it up in form of windrow burning or chaff carts?
Not the chaff carts, but certainly the narrow windrow burning. I've got 4 or 5 clients that are probably doing it for 3 or even 4 years now.
Yep.
And not across their whole acreage, doing it selectively, on problem paddocks, or selectively after a break crop phase.
Yep.
In our part of the world, we've had a great reliance on herbicide tolerant canola with residual herbicides at sowing time. That's been a great band-aid for us for 1 year. We're now seeing that ryegrass population change and come up late, and we're still seeing ryegrass set seed under our canola, which was our clean-up crop. So our first wheat crop, has got that 10, 20 plants per square metre of ryegrass. And although they might not be taking away the yield of the crop, they're setting seed and topping up that seed bank.
Yep.
So I've got some clients where we're using it selectively, and it's just working really well.
Yep.
I can think of one grower. He's not a big farmer. He puts 500 acres of crop in. He's actually a school teacher, and we've driven his ryegrass populations nearly to nothing.
Right.
And we're still using pre-emergent herbicides and good crop rotation to prevent any blowouts. But that harvest weed seed management has really been. It's been 10 times better than what I expected it was going to be.
Yep.
And I think it's got a big home with all of our growers. There's been talk about it's too hard and you can't burn every single acre and things like that. But I think we need to change our mindset from making excuses to standing back and saying, okay, what have we got to do?
Yep.
We've got to be proactive and let's take a step forward and employ some tactics that have been proven to work.
Yeah, they have.
Yeah.
Well, here's some more proof. We'll go to a comment here, and maybe Rowan, if you've still got a question, or has Ray scared you off there? But go to this comment. This is a comment from a webinar viewer, David. David says that Harvest Weed Seed Management took our annual ryegrass population from 5,000 plants per square metre to 500 in 1 year. Now this was achieved through narrow windrow burning and herbicides, and it just again reinforces Ray's HSD effectiveness and why many growers should be adopting it. He says it would be much easier than burning narrow windrows, ! So narrow windrow burning is a great sort of entry point, but it does have its challenges, and we do have other options in the chaff cart and in the development of the HSD. Rowan, do you have a question there?
Yeah, Michael, just expanding a little bit on that, the northern system, but as far as your summer crop goes, to actually break up, say, hitting that Ornus barnyard grass with Roundup for years in a fallow, like, do you see any tactics for a summer crop, say a mung beans or something, or do you see that that could fit for a one-off harvest seed control with a crop like that?
One of the things we found with Ornus barnyard grass, specifically in sorghum, the plants grew quite close to the ground, so a lot of the seed that was being produced was below the harvest height. So that's one of the ways in which that approach would not fit such a crop as sorghum. Your other question was in relation to...
Say a mung bean crop.
Yeah, sure. Like we didn't do our survey work in mung bean crops to see what weeds were surviving in that crop. But again, I guess you've got more of a closed canopy that might encourage your barnyard grass to grow more upright because it has to compete more so against the crop. So potentially there might be a role for harvest weed seed control in mung beans. But again, we haven't been there and we haven't collected the data. So it's a bit hard to say at this stage.
Thanks, Rowan. Thanks, Michael. We've got another question from the floor here.
Yeah, John Stevenson, grain grower from Lockhart. Just want to ask the panel, we've used pre-emergent chemistry and in-crop chemistry pretty well to select for resistance. If we go down the path of harvest weed seed collection, are we then going to start selecting for early shedding wild oats and low seeding ryegrass, like below beer can height? I mean, evolution's a pretty powerful tool. So
I can comment on that. I don't know if anybody else wants to swing at it first, but...
I'll say that weeds are amazing things and they will evolve to every selection pressure we put on them. So that really reinforces the importance of having multiple control options and integrated weed management and diverse rotations. Rotations are one of the major determinants of weed evolution.
Yeah, and I'll make some comments. Firstly, to quote Stephen Powers, Steve always says if you're on a good thing, don't stick to it, which probably means if you're towing a HSD, it probably means you don't tow it forever or every year perhaps. We need to think about that one. Having said that, we haven't seen any evidence of it yet in Western Australia. It was measured, but probably 10 years ago, where David Ferris from Department of Ag and Food, he measured ryegrass from a long-term chaff cart user, from a golf course where it was mowed, and compared it to a control and found no difference in the height and the seed retention and so on. But we know ryegrass is the world champion of developing resistance. It also develops more dormancy, as was alluded to before, and yeah, it probably will. Now, in terms of it growing prostrate, growing along the ground, that doesn't make any sense because there's no light and there's no advantage down there. In terms of early shedding, yeah, and early flowering, they could definitely be things that we select for. So there's no doubt, and so it is not one fix, but fitted in with a range of other tools. We believe that the risk is still very low. So you guys have got a long time to go. If you haven't used the tools, we've been using them for 20 years in some paddocks and still not seeing much of a problem. So for a lot of you, it won't be a problem for a long time if it does become a problem.
Peter, with that, like in our program, we're now windrowing half our barley at 26% moisture. And we've got windrowing to work very well. Been doing it for 35 years, and just out of interest, you sow up and back. Don't worry about the tram lines. You windrow straight across and it holds it up like bridge pylons. And we've introduced that, and Michael Walsh has done the work at home. And you then capture 95 to 98% of the weeds into the windrow. So you just put that in as a tool. So I'm sure it's all going to evolve, but we humans are going to keep having to shift left and right if we want to stay in the game. We're just going to have to open our minds up and keep shifting what we do.
The other thing that I'd like to say is that the secret is if we get our numbers down the resistance is going to happen to all these things, but if we keep mixing it up, because we've got this experience of dealing with problem weeds, it's going to take much, much longer to evolve. You let it blow out, then it's going to be a major issue.
Okay, we've spoken about harvest weed seed control for quite a while now, and there are other things to talk about in terms of managing the weed seed bank. So we probably need to move on to some of the issues. So other questions from the webinar and from the audience, perhaps if we do move on from harvest weed seed control. We've got a comment from Kylie here from Queensland. She says, if we use Weed Seeker to spot spray at huge rates of glyphosate, how long will this extend the usefulness of this chemical? There's an easy one for you, Michael. I can have a swing at it as well if you like.
Thanks, Kylie, for that question. The real benefit of a weed seeker is you can target your low densities of weeds. The other real benefit is because you're only putting on a small volume of herbicide, you're able to use more expensive herbicides that you may not use on a broad acre scale. So I would be advising, if you're using weed seeker technology, that you not be applying glyphosate through it, but you look at what other alternatives are available to control these weeds that perhaps have already survived a treatment of glyphosate. By bumping up your rate of glyphosate, you in effect are changing your selection pressure with that herbicide, but you are changing it towards selecting for individuals that are able to survive a higher rate. So in the end, I suggest you'd probably still end up with glyphosate resistance, but you'd end up with a very high level of resistance. So my suggestion would be that you go to an alternative mode of action and not stick with glyphosate.
That's great, yeah. I mean, the other thing about the Weed Seeker, it is only, you can only use products at registered field rates, and so the huge rates of glyphosate is actually off-label for a start. The other thing to mention is that plants develop resistance to glyphosate in different ways, and at the moment there's 6 known different mechanisms, and some are stronger than others. And so the huge rates of glyphosate might kill some of the ones with low level resistance, so it may slow down the process a little bit. But knowing that there are multiple mechanisms, I think we will eventually get the resistance, and like you said, when you develop resistance, a very strong resistance mechanism, so they're very resistant plants.
Can I just add one more thing there? If you are going through and using something such as a weed seeker on a low density population and you have survivors, it's important to do something to those survivors so they don't set seed. If those survivors don't set seed, you don't have a problem. If they set seed, for whatever reason they've survived, you're perpetuating the problem. And if you have gone through and used a higher rate of glyphosate through a weed seeker and you've got survivors and you do nothing about it, I think you're going to cause problems for yourself in the future. You really have to stop seed set on those survivors.
Still on the theme of detection, we've got a comment from Remy Dehaan. While on-ground detection mechanisms like the green seeker or weed seeker seem to have been around for a while, does the panel see significant opportunities for the use of RPAs or drones in the detection process? I've been a little bit involved in this. Ken, have you got any experience from GRDC about the detection technology?
Well, that's what we've got some investment in detection technology at the moment, but we've also got an expression of interest specifically in this area of trying to find mechanisms of being able to detect weeds, not just in fallows, but also in crop. And whether that ends up being an initial drone going across and detecting the weeds and coming through with the weed control after, or it's a one-stop shop, we'll wait and see. But yes, we've got investment in that area.
Yeah, and I agree. I think put simply, if you've got a machine that's trying to detect a green weed in a green crop and spray it immediately, you've got very quick computing time, whereas using something like a drone or some other technique of capturing the images, you've got more time to then turn those images into a weed spraying map.
I'd like to just comment that with the increase in cost of herbicides and the cost of labour, that these sort of techniques are going to become much more important in the future to reduce the costs of chemicals and labour.
Yep. Okay, moving on to a herbicide-based question from Mark C. On the webinar. In addition to the cost of herbicide development, it is also a fact that there has not been a new herbicide mode of action discovered anywhere in the world for the past 20 years. Is there any research in finding new novel chemicals?
I'll take
Ken,
that one,
good
Peter.
on you.
Yes, there is, but Mark is right. There hasn't been any new mode of action found for 20 years. And there's been probably a lack of research into that area for at least the last decade. And it probably is due to the successfulness of glyphosate. But now that's unravelling. It is generating more interest from the chemical companies. Now, it may not be the same type of mechanisms that were looked for in the past. They are also looking at the major chemical companies are looking at a range of integrated management. So the herbicide, or the bit you buy from the shop, may be only one part of the package that you end up applying. Obviously, we've seen the herbicide and the crop come together. They're looking at packaging a range of things to come together to control the weeds. And yes, they're not available now, and we may not see them at least for 5 years, but possibly another 10 years. So it's really important that we do the jobs we can do now and maintain our present chemistry till these new technologies come along. As I said, it's $150 to $250 million to bring new technology onto the market. It's going to take a while for that investment to get through and get through all the regulatory hoops as well before it's commercially available to use. So it's really important that we use integrated weed management like the seed destructions, crop competition, to manage our weeds.
Peter,
thanks, Ken.
From the global conference, you'd understand it better than I, the RNA development with RNAi. Yep, you could explain it better than I could after that conference.
I don't think I will try and explain it right, but I guess it is trying to come up with a herbicide in a different way that targets a specific strand of RNA in a plant rather than most herbicide target enzymes. It is very exciting technology. There's also a lot of challenges with it because it is really specific down to a specific RNA strand. So if you have a plant with multiple modes of resistance, you might only be able to knock out one of them with that technology. Having said that, that could be the next big development. Monsanto and some of the other companies are investing heavily in it because they see that as potentially the way of getting a new herbicide. So essentially they've found a way of stabilising RNA and putting it in a drum, spraying it onto plants, and the plants take up RNA.
Can I comment?
Deirdre will comment, yeah.
Another potential form of new herbicide mode of actions are from allelopathy, studying natural exudates from either plants or crops that suppress neighbours and identifying those chemicals. There are opportunities there for potential new herbicide modes of action.
Well, the product mesotrione came from an Australian scientist noticing no weeds under his bottle brush plant, so that's where that one came from. Okay, comment from Maury on the webinar. High rates of glyphosate just selects for stronger resistance. So going back to the talk about using high rates of glyphosate through the weed seeker, that's a comment from someone in the field who has just seen that no, higher rates are not the answer. Okay, so we're about an hour in, and we're going to keep it running for a little while longer, I believe, for another 20 minutes or so. So that's great. We've got another question here, and after this question I'd like to move the conversation on to crop competition. And so people on the webinar, perhaps you might like to send some questions in on crop competition. So if we have the microphone over here, another question from the floor.
Eric Armstrong, research agronomist here at Wagga with DPI. This is more a comment and also a question. My vision, and I work with pulses, is to take them from the weak link in the rotation to your secret weapon. And I'm going to ask the comment, we're looking at developing crops like peas and lentils, which you can sow late, giving you a big window of weed control opportunities and getting them to mature very, very early and still maintaining yield and production, and using things like crop topping or even windrowing or things like this to actually destroy the weeds and yet maintain your yield so you have your cake and eat it. So that's my thought and comment, and I'm wondering whether anybody else might have a comment on that in the direction we're going.
Well, I personally think that's a great direction, and the reason being we had a discussion a minute ago about we're selecting for weeds that are going to be more dormant and germinate later and so on. So if we have a range of crops that can be sown at different times, that will obviously just confuse the weeds. The other part of it for me, with lupins in Western Australia, they're seen as a crop that a lot of people can't grow any longer because they can't kill wild radish. But growers have called me and said, look, I know that the herbicides in lupins are not strong, but in lupins I can use a pre-em, I can spray twice post-em, I can crop top, and then I can burn windrows. So I'm getting multiple hits at the weeds, but they're not all with the post-emergent herbicide. So that can be where the strength of some of the pulses and alternative crops come from. Anybody else for a comment there? No?
Oh, I'd love to grow peas now, but I farm in forest gravel country. And the trouble is the little gravel stones are the same size as the pea, and you sell them and someone knocks their teeth out. So sadly, I can't grow them anymore. I've tried chickpeas, the whole lot, but that's the problem with my country with the gravel. So, but I agree with what you're saying. That crop topping option, yeah.
Well, it's all about diversity, isn't it? So that's bringing more diversity to the system.
And also, if you've got more vigorous genotypes that have those other attributes as well, there's another advantage for you in competition.
We'll get the pea crop to stand up.
Yeah, I've tried Casper. Yeah.
We might hold your question for a moment and we'll move to a webinar question here. Comment from Tony, or a question: how much value has narrow row spacing and early sowing to increase competition against ryegrass? So Deirdre, you're someone who has a lot of experience in crop competition with weeds. Would you like to make a comment there?
Well, the research has clearly shown worldwide that having narrower row spacings will lead to a more competitive crop. It's quite simple. Also, increasing crop seeding rate is an important agronomic tactic to suppress weeds and maintain crop yields in the presence of weeds. So very important, low cost, relatively simple tactic to help manage weeds.
And you told me about a study that was done many years ago looking at seeding rate and the impact on weeds, and was it something like double the seeding rate and halve the weed seed set, or?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think when it was done.
Put you on the spot there.
It was probably done in the 90s. It was a collaborative research project where we looked at increasing wheat seeding rate, and we had a number of different crop wheat varieties, and we went from really low rainfall areas out in the West Merredin right through to higher rainfall areas, and we found that across the southern wheat belt, at the higher seeding rates, doubling crop seeding rate halved the weed seed production and maintained crop yield in the presence of annual ryegrass. So very effective. There were questions in those days about whether high seeding rates would hay off. We found that didn't happen. We tended to have less tillers in the high seeding rate crops and bigger seeds, and we didn't have any shrunken grain. So that was even in the low rainfall areas.
This is a topic I'm fairly passionate about. The little bit of work I was involved with did show exactly the same as all of the other work on crop competition. Increase more crop growth, less weed growth. It's pretty simple. The work we had was increasing our wheat seeding rate by 40 kilograms, halved our ryegrass seed set in the presence or absence of herbicide. So in one case it turns Sakura from a 95 to a 99% herbicide. So and then the row spacing review paper from the Graham Centre here. The author's name, Brendan Scott.
Brendan Scott.
Yep. Just clearly shows narrow row spacings yield more in wheat in Australia if you're above about 1.5 tonnes per hectare yield. So there's more yield and there's less weeds to be had. So more crop, less weeds. That's our motto.
Going on to what you said earlier, Peter, also, if weed seed levels are really low, it allows you to do the dry sowing, so you can go for the narrow row spacings. You're not worried so much about waiting for that moisture to bring your crops and get weed control.
Yeah. And so for us, if you can halve the weed seed set through competition and then take half or more at harvest with a harvest seed control tool, we can get 80% of the weed seeds out of the way without going near a herbicide. Lachlan, you've got a lot of experience in seeding systems, comparing discs and tines and so on. Your thoughts on row spacing for this part of the world and seeding rate?
We've got a number of clients that are going wider to get through more stubble. 12 inches probably a common figure for row spacing on tine seeders to get through stubble and also allow an effective sowing speed. My observations from in the paddock is in tune with all that. The wider the row spacing, the more sunlight I get down there, the less crop competition I'm seeing. I was in a paddock of wheat yesterday sowing on 9 inch, and the ryegrass that was there hadn't choked out the crop. The ryegrass seed heads were as high as the wheat heads were. So in terms of employing some harvest weed seed management tactics, it was going to be very easy. If that grower didn't do his beer can height and went gumboot height, he was still getting a large percentage of the seeds. We've got a number of guys that are adopting disc seeding systems to try and get less ryegrass establishing from less soil disturbance and encouraging those weeds. If the weed seed bank is there to start with, the weeds are going to keep coming up.
Yeah.
That's possibly a tactic. Lower levels of soil disturbance could be a tool in the toolbox, but it's certainly not a silver bullet
with a disc seeder
on its own.
Yeah.
The row spacing is a big debate in our part of the world, and clearly there's a trade-off with yield being left on the table.
Yep.
But being able to maintain a sowing speed on a big program, especially guys that have still got tine seeders, it's a big thing. You're probably talking 30 to 40% difference in acres per day. So I guess the growers have got to add that into their equation, and
the speed of sowing.
Speed of sowing,
slower
that's with
the
tine,
narrow space.
Yeah, that's with the tine seeder.
Yeah, well, it's not my experience in WA. Some of the new machines doing the full 10 k's an hour at 7-inch row spacing, but obviously might be different soil conditions and so on. Just while we're on this topic, if we go to a comment from David here, we're currently conducting a crop trial in Western Victoria looking at higher sowing rate in barley and wheat to improve crop weed competitiveness. Early results have shown that there was a significantly earlier canopy closure. However, this may lead to other issues around disease control and water use efficiency. So I don't know if Lachlan, you wanted to continue on with comments there. Obviously the thicker crop, maybe a bit more moisture, a bit more disease like powdery mildew and so on in the crop. Have you seen any of that evidence? Or?
Look, I think the environmental conditions of the growing season probably dictate that more so.
Right.
Is that early canopy closure possibly accentuating those issues? It could be. But then again, is that offset by the competitiveness you're getting with the early ryegrass? Yeah. The water use efficiency, well, I think the row spacing against the plant density, if we could have a narrow row spacing but with a lower plant density, we can manage that canopy but still close it early.
Yep.
So we're not growing a big, thick, lush canopy that's going to potentially hay off in the spring, but we've closed it and shut the light out from the weeds. So that could be part of the parcel.
Well, I think any grower who's ever seen a seeding gap or a miss has seen how well the weeds grow in there. So we've seen a lot of evidence, and any grower who's buying a new seeding machine and choosing the row spacing really needs to look at that review paper, because they reviewed 89 trials around the country and found it's a very strong data set, isn't it, suggesting the higher wheat yield from narrower row spacings. Michael, you wanted to say something?
Just a quick comment. The effectiveness of crop competition is going to differ depending on what weed species you have present. So having an understanding of, I guess, the ecology of the weed species you're targeting and the level of competitiveness that they provide can also help you then to decide, I've got this weed, is crop competition a tactic I should be using or not using? For example, in the north, again, the two common species I keep talking about today, common south thistle and fleabane, poorly competitive in crop. So crop competition is a real tactic that you can use to limit seed production of these species, and also limit the pressure you're placing on your in-crop herbicides to control those weed species.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, you've been waiting for a long time for your question there.
Thanks, Peter. David Coddington's my name, from DuPont Pioneer, and my question's about the canola system. I think when you're talking crop competition, we can actually probably go to a narrow row spacing within the canola system. Use of hybrid canola is obviously a much more competitive plant than an open pollinator variety. And just a comment, I suppose, but the main question is, my main concern within the canola systems is the use short term of the herbicide clethodim. I think there's probably more pressure being put on that with regard to ryegrass control and black oats than what there is, say, with the glyphosate. Short term, if we target the use of glyphosate in a canola system, such as genetic modified canola, I think it might be short term, but it's probably a good strategy, and it's another tool in the box that we need to be looking at and addressing a lot wider than what we are at the moment.
Yep. they're good comments. And firstly, I'll make the comment that the row spacing review paper that I just referred to, they also did the other crops, and canola responded just the same as wheat in that narrower row spacings, higher yield. So that was a good bit of data that I hadn't seen. I'd like to throw to Murray here. Murray, would you like to talk about how you use Roundup Ready canola and your management package around that?
Yeah, we've been using Roundup Readies for the last 5 years, and they are a very useful tool. They're certainly not a silver bullet. Anyone that's got ryegrass problems and expecting that Roundup Ready crops are going to fix them, you're going to be sorely disappointed. But they are a very useful tool for mixing it up. I think we think they're probably a very good use in following a brown manure. So you've really knocked your numbers down the year before, and you can come in again and knock it down again. Yeah, I think it's like everything. Another tool in the toolbox is a very useful thing to have.
When I spoke to you the other day, you were saying you use paraquat, and a pre-emergent?
Yes, we always go in with a pre-emergent. That's one of the lessons I learned on my Nuffield Scholarship in the US. They stopped using pre-emergents, and they've found to their detriment that they've got Roundup resistance very quickly. So very important to use a pre-emergent. Important if you're growing a Roundup Ready, like David said, you want a variety that's vigorous. You know, you can't use your Roundup after the 6-leaf stage, so you want the ground covered at 6-leaf stage. Very important. And then the following year, if we've got to use Roundup, we always double knock with paraquat afterwards, so that you're just not relying on Roundup, because Roundup's such a wonderful and useful herbicide, or glyphosate. If we lose that, we're going to get ourselves in a lot of trouble, especially considering that places like Europe have already lost paraquat. So, if we lose paraquat through the regulation, and then we use glyphosate because we've abused it, where does that leave us?
Yeah. So you use a double knock the following year, and you're also burning the narrow windrows of the canola, aren't you? So you're getting a knockdown beforehand, you're using your Roundup in crop and a pre-emergent and a narrow windrow. So 4 shots at the weeds in 1 year with different tools. Yeah. And I agree, clethodim is under enormous pressure. In Western Australia, we've seen it really fall over in a big way in the last couple of years. Canola can really not tolerate any more than the 500 mils. Obviously, any more than 500 mils is off-label, it is at 500 mils we are really struggling to control ryegrass in canola. And it's similar to glyphosate really in its timing, isn't it? You can't really go too late into the crop using clethodim in canola without damage.
Looking at longer term management, non-chemical management in canola, we have a PhD student who's looking at differences in genotype allelopathy in canola, and we're finding very big differences. And so that provides a potential for breeding for a stronger allelopathic varieties in the future. We've got to think about these long-term strategies. It's important to think about short-term, but we've got to think about what happens in 10 years if we don't have any chemicals left. We might be breeding for competitive ability.
Okay, we've got a comment from Maury come in on the webinar. Fire breaks and non-competitive situations will develop as our greatest source of resistance. What can we do here? So I guess what Maury's talking about is particularly an over-reliance on glyphosate on fence lines, and many growers I've visited around the country have told me that they use a lot of glyphosate on the fence line, develop resistance there, and then it spread into the paddock. Michael, did you want to have a swing at this one first, or?
I can have a go at it. I guess the principle for weed management on your non-crop areas is the same for your cropping areas. So again, it's not going to be one tactic that's going to provide you with 100% control for long term. So residual herbicides, I think, would play an important role in these areas. Also, the mention there in the question was about non-competitive areas, so whether or not there's an opportunity to, I don't know, maybe sow a pasture or a grass or something in those areas to compete with those weeds. That's the only things that I can think of off the top of my head, but I don't know if anyone else has got comment.
Peter, it's a perennial problem with full-time crop, but we now actually, the old days with the growers, you've got a bit of weed along the edge, you pull in and leave 6 inches. Well, we're the other way now. We naturally in our terrain we've got rock ridge lines, and we've haven't got the big wide open sand plain country. We actually now with the HSDs we go out after it, and we'll hang the front out, and we'll take everything right up to the fence that survived a spray. So we've got a different philosophy. You don't hide from it. You actually go back and get it. Like you'll get a rock outcrop, you hang the front out a foot into it and take the whole lot and put it through. So it's about a total different mindset again.
Yep.
Go out after it and smash it up.
Lachlan, you're an agronomist. Do you have any strategies you're using with clients on fence lines?
Yeah, definitely. Look, at residual chemistry is rule 101. There's no point killing what's there because something's going to grow back. And if it's during the growing season, well, chances are it's going to be the same species that was there beforehand anyhow. So we need to put residual chemistry down. We need to go back and make sure that we've killed the weed in the first place. So going and doing some scouting and making sure that it's dead, or even just rolling a double knock in the same process. A lot of our guys, they do their fire breaks too late, and even with high rates of water on their little ute or ATV sprayers, you get a lot of shading.
Yeah.
So that's an issue that I contend with. So
bring in it early using a residual.
Bring it early, and if it is going to be late,
follow up.
Double knock
Yeah.
for sure, and go the opposite direction.
Yep.
So you're getting some penetration
Okay.
down into the canopy, and maximising that.
That's a good point.
So everyone likes a nice clean fence line for springtime when you're driving around sticky beaking at everybody's crops. But so I think we've got to spend some time inspecting our fence lines. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think CSU might even have a little bit of work going on sowing lucerne or something like that around the perimeters of paddocks, to remove that seed source out. A little bit of lucerne hay or something like that. So, alternative strategies there as well.
Yeah, the other one I've seen is cropping to the fence and baling hay along the fence, so you've got competition right there. I should mention that the Glyphosate Sustainability Working Group are busy doing work in this area. They're led by Chris Preston at Uni of Adelaide, and they're certainly doing a lot of fence line trials around the country. The problem I see is that glyphosate is the best herbicide by the length of the straight, and so coming up with the second best alternative is quite a challenge, but they're coming up with some good options there.
Pete, around here, a lot of growers that have gone stock free of going down the road of no fences.
Yeah, that's happened in our area. A mate of mine bought a farm, 2,000 hectares, was 17 paddocks, now it's 2 paddocks. That's the sort of thing that's happening, big paddocks, up and back seeding, yeah.
There has been some research done across the southern wheat belt looking at a range of different residual chemicals, and so that information should be available at the regional level for the the best chemicals for the residual chemicals for the fence lines.
And the same work's been done in Western Australia with Celipeltzers.
Yeah.
We're using the regional cropping groups over there.
We trialled Amatrol this year. Peter, we trialled Amatrol this year.
How'd that go?
Yeah, it does a good job, but it floats a bit out into the crop. It's Amatrol and paraquat. It's a little bit drifty, so only did 120 litre to try it, but it's not out of the game.
Yep.
Yeah.
Comment from Jack at WeWar, New South Wales. Any work done with sowing orientation and crop shading, e.g. sowing north-south versus east-west? I'm aware of some in Western Australia. Any over here? Not in this part of the world. So Catherine Borger, Department of Agriculture and Food, also she's aligned with AHRI as well, based at Merredin, has done a few years of research here and finding that the east-west crop orientation significantly reducing weed biomass through shading. So if you think of winter with the sun being in the northern hemisphere, the east-west orientation, once the cereal crop gets up a bit, it does shade the interrow. So there certainly is some research there. Okay, another comment from Caroline. Clethodim, also a big problem where large areas of pulses are growing. We are finding that higher rates are needed in the southern mallee. Many escapes of ryegrass this year to lower rates. And you're probably where we were in Western Australia a few years ago. When I started as an agronomist, it was in 1998, we used to use 75 mils of clethodim mixed with some fusilade. By the time I finished my work as a company agronomist, we were up to the 250 mils of clethodim, and it's moved well and truly beyond that now. And in Western Australia, very high rates are still failing. The reason that high rates of clethodim work on resistant ryegrass is that it's a weak target site, and so you can overcome that through higher rates. But obviously, as you use higher rates, you select for the most resistant plants in the population, and eventually you have more resistant plants. Any other comments about clethodim? Lachlan, you might be well placed to comment on that one.
Yeah, we know with ryegrass in this part of the world that there is a rate response. So most growers are probably running with that 500 mil rate now, and we know that there's a rate response up to that rate. Going past the 500 mils really isn't gaining you anything at all. But hitting the weeds while they're early and small, before they get a good root system on them, it's important. And having that pre-emergent herbicide up front to make sure that your clethidim's targeting less numbers, because it's just a numbers game at the end of the day.
And Michael, clethodim in the north, it's being used in all sorts of situations, isn't it?
It is. Group A chemistry is now starting to be used quite commonly in fallow situations, most prominently to control our summer grass species. We've got those glyphosate resistant species I've talked about. We've also got what we would class as glyphosate tolerant species like feathertop Rhodes grass. So unfortunately, for species such as those, there's not too many knockdown options available. As you'd probably all be aware, resistance develops quite quickly to the Group A chemistries. So I can see in the very near future we're going to end up with populations with cross resistance to glyphosate and your Group A's. If you are using Group A's in fallows, firstly, don't do anything that's off-label. There are some minor use permits, and they all include using Group A's as part of a double knock. So they can't be used on their own in fallows. So you have to check those permits out.
Thanks, Michael. All right, it's time to wrap things up now. In the wrap-up, I'd like to once again draw your attention to WeedSmart and the 10-point plan. A lot of what we've talked about today is part of that WeedSmart 10-point plan. So the WeedSmart website has information on each of the 10 points, things like stopping weed seed set, capturing weed seeds at harvest, rotation of crops and modes of action, and testing for resistance and so on. Don't automatically reach for the glyphosate. As I mentioned earlier, WeedSmart was really an awareness campaign. We're moving that to more of a solutions campaign. We really want to load a lot of information onto the website that is practical and helps growers. We are in the process of doing that, so there's a little bit more information there now, but keep coming back to the WeedSmart website because we will have more information up as we go. I'd also like to thank GRDC for supporting the event, and also Deb Slinger, is that right, for allowing us to use the venue at the DPI here. I guess and I think that's all I have in the thank yous, other than to thank the panel: Ray Harrington, Murray Scholes, Michael Witterick, Lachlan Caldwell, Ken Young and Deirdre Lamurl. Got all of those out. Thank you very much for your time and travel to be here today. I think we've had a really great discussion, and it is recorded so that we can come back to it in the future. I guess in closing, what we've talked a lot about today is interesting stuff, and I think a lot of people agree, but the challenge is taking that into action, isn't it? So the challenge to the growers and agronomists listening out there, the challenge is to have an experience that is a good experience about managing resistant weeds. So I would lay down the challenge that that growers should think about a plan and maybe think about a paddock and do something in that paddock and prove to yourself that some of these things work, because hearing from us is one thing, but seeing and believing yourself is another. So thank you again. Thank you to the live audience. Thank you to everybody watching live on the webinar broadcast, and we'll close it there. Thank you very much.